The salt spray stung Lieutenant Commander James Mitchell's face as he crouched beside the twisted steel hull fragments scattered across the dock at Portsmouth Naval Yard on the morning of March 23, 1943. The remnants of U-boat 567 lay before him like pieces of a deadly puzzle, each jagged shard still reeking of diesel fuel and the metallic tang of seawater. Mitchell ran his fingers along one particular section of hull plating, feeling something that made his pulse quicken. The steel felt wrong somehow, brittle in a way that contradicted everything he knew about German engineering. His commanding officers had ordered him to focus on the submarine's torpedo mechanisms, to catalog the enemy's weapons for intelligence purposes. But this hull fragment whispered of something far more significant, something that could change the entire course of the war beneath the waves. As he lifted the piece of steel toward the pale morning light, studying the crystalline structure visible in its fractured edge, Mitchell made a decision that would defy direct orders from the Admiralty itself. He would pursue this anomaly, no matter the consequences. No one in the Royal Navy's Metallurgy Division knew that one man's disobedience that morning would expose a fatal flaw that would help doom the entire German U-boat fleet. James Mitchell had never intended to become the man who would revolutionize naval warfare. Born in the small industrial town of Sheffield in 1912, he was the son of a steel mill foreman who taught him to read metal the way other children learned to read books. His father, Thomas Mitchell, had worked the blast furnaces for 37 years, developing an almost supernatural ability to judge steel quality by touch, sound, and even smell. Young James spent his childhood wandering through the mills after school, absorbing lessons about carbon content and metallurgical chemistry that most university students never learned. By age 16, he could identify different steel grades simply by striking them with a hammer and listening to the ring. His mother, Mary, worried that her son was destined for a life of industrial labor like his father, but Thomas saw something different in the boy's analytical mind. When James earned a scholarship to study metallurgical engineering at Cambridge University in 1930, it fulfilled his father's greatest ambition. The young man excelled in his studies, particularly in the emerging field of metal fatigue analysis, writing his thesis on crystalline stress patterns in ship steel. Upon graduation in 1934, he joined the Royal Navy as a technical officer, specializing in materials analysis for warship construction. His peers initially viewed him with suspicion, seeing him as a mill worker's son playing at being an officer. But Mitchell's uncanny ability to diagnose metal failures quickly earned respect throughout the engineering corps. By 1939, he had become the Navy's leading expert on submarine hull analysis, a specialty that seemed academic until Germany's U-boats began prowling the Atlantic. He had no idea that soon those instincts would be all that stood between Allied shipping and total catastrophe. The Battle of the Atlantic had begun in earnest on September 3, 1939, when German submarine U-30 torpedoed the passenger liner Athenia just hours after Britain declared war. What followed was a campaign of unprecedented maritime destruction that threatened to strangle Britain's lifeline to the outside world. German U-boats, operating in deadly wolf packs coordinated by Admiral Karl Dönitz, were sinking Allied merchant vessels faster than they could be replaced. The mathematics of destruction were staggering. In 1942 alone, U-boats sank over 6 million tons of Allied shipping, sending more than 1,200 vessels to the bottom of the Atlantic. British imports dropped by nearly one-third, threatening the island nation with starvation and industrial collapse. The German submarine fleet had grown from 57 boats at the war's beginning to over 400 by early 1943. With new Type 7 and Type 9 submarines rolling off the assembly lines at an alarming pace. These vessels represented the pinnacle of German engineering, featuring advanced torpedo systems, sophisticated hydrophone equipment, and hull designs that could withstand crushing depths of up to 250 meters. Intelligence reports suggested that German metallurgists had developed new steel alloys specifically for submarine construction, creating vessels that were both lighter and stronger than their predecessors. Allied anti-submarine warfare efforts had achieved limited success through convoy systems and improved sonar technology, but the fundamental problem remained. U-boats were simply too well built and numerous to stop through conventional means. Royal Navy losses mounted daily, with destroyer crews reporting that depth charges seemed increasingly ineffective against the newer German submarines. The steel mills of Germany's Ruhr Valley worked around the clock, feeding an industrial machine that threatened to win the war beneath the waves. As Mitchell studied intelligence reports in his cramped office at Portsmouth, he realized that traditional naval tactics were losing a war of industrial attrition. The Allies needed a breakthrough that could exploit some fundamental weakness in German submarine design, but no such vulnerability seemed to exist. The crisis deepened throughout the winter of 1942 as U-boat attacks reached unprecedented levels of coordination and effectiveness. Operation Drumbeat had brought German submarines to the very shores of America, sinking tankers within sight of East Coast beaches and creating a second front in the Battle of the Atlantic. Admiral Dunitz's Wolfpack tactics were reaching mathematical perfection, with radio-coordinated submarine groups converging on convoys like schools of mechanical sharks. British Admiralty estimates suggested that unless the tide turned soon, the island nation would be forced to negotiate a separate peace within 18 months. Mitchell found himself assigned to an increasingly desperate mission, analyzing captured German submarine components for any exploitable weakness. The Royal Navy had managed to raise several U-boat wrecks from relatively shallow waters, providing unprecedented access to German submarine technology. Previous examinations had focused on weapons systems, communications equipment, and propulsion mechanisms, but had yielded little actionable intelligence. German engineering appeared to be uniformly excellent, with submarine components that often surpassed British equivalents in both design and construction quality. Mitchell's superiors at the Admiralty had grown impatient with the Metallurgy Division's lack of breakthrough discoveries, demanding that resources be redirected toward more immediately practical concerns like torpedo technology and periscope optics. But something about the accumulated hull samples nagged at Mitchell's analytical mind, a subtle pattern that he couldn't quite articulate even to himself. The steel felt different somehow, not just in composition, but in the way it had failed under stress. German submarines that had been destroyed by depth charges showed fracture patterns that seemed inconsistent with the high-quality steel that intelligence reports described. Against direct orders to prioritize weapons analysis, Mitchell began conducting unauthorized metallurgical tests on hull fragments during his off-duty hours. He set up a makeshift laboratory in a storage shed near the Portsmouth docks, using equipment borrowed from the main materials laboratory. His commanding officer, Captain Reginald Thornbury, had explicitly forbidden this type of speculative research, arguing that the Navy needed concrete intelligence, not theoretical metallurgical studies. But Mitchell couldn't shake the feeling that the answer to defeating U-boats lay hidden in the very steel from which they were constructed. The breakthrough came on a rain-soaked evening in early April 1943, when Mitchell was conducting stress tests on hull samples in his unauthorized laboratory. He had been subjecting steel fragments to various temperature and pressure combinations, trying to replicate the conditions that U-boats experienced during depth charge attacks. Most of the samples behaved exactly as expected, showing the resilience and strength that made German submarines so formidable. But one particular piece from U-boat 567 exhibited a disturbing anomaly when subjected to rapid temperature changes. As Mitchell cycled the steel fragment between hot and cold extremes, simulating the thermal shock of an underwater explosion, The metal began to develop microscopic fractures along its grain boundaries. Under his improvised microscope, he could see crystalline structures separating in ways that suggested fundamental flaws in the steel's molecular composition. The discovery sent his pulse racing, but he needed to understand the mechanism behind the failure before he could determine whether it represented a broader vulnerability. Working through the night by lamplight, Mitchell subjected additional hull samples to similar tests, finding that nearly 70% showed similar weaknesses when exposed to specific thermal conditions. The pattern became clear. German submarine steel contained trace elements that made it susceptible to catastrophic failure under certain stress combinations that existing Allied weapons couldn't produce. But the implications were staggering, because if this flaw was universal in German submarine construction, it could be exploited to create entirely new types of anti-submarine weapons. Mitchell realized that conventional depth charges and torpedoes weren't designed to create the specific thermal and pressure conditions necessary to trigger this metallurgical weakness. He would need to develop entirely new weapons concepts based on his understanding of the steel flaw, but such research would require resources and authorization that his superiors had already denied. As dawn broke over Portsmouth Harbor, Mitchell understood that he faced a choice between obedience and innovation. He could file a routine report that would likely be ignored by bureaucrats focused on immediate tactical concerns, or he could risk his career by pursuing unauthorized weapons development based on his discovery. The mathematics of war demanded bold action, and Mitchell knew that thousands of Allied sailors were dying while officials debated proper procedures. He made a decision that would change everything. He would develop new anti-submarine weapons in secret, using his discovery about German steel weakness as the foundation for a revolutionary approach to underwater warfare. Over the following weeks, Mitchell embarked on a dangerous game of deception that would have ended his career had his superiors discovered his activities. He began collaborating with Dr. Margaret Whitfield, a civilian chemist working on explosive compounds at a nearby research facility, sharing his discoveries about German steel weakness while carefully omitting the unauthorized nature of his research. Whitfield was immediately intrigued by the possibility of creating new explosive formulations designed specifically to exploit metallurgical vulnerabilities, rather than relying purely on concussive force. Together, they developed theoretical weapons concepts that combined thermal and pressure effects in ways that could trigger catastrophic failure in German submarine hulls. The key insight was that existing depth charges relied on blunt force trauma to damage submarines, but Mitchell's steel analysis suggested that properly calibrated thermal shock could cause hull failures with far less explosive material. This meant that smaller, more accurate weapons could potentially sink German submarines that could survive direct hits from traditional depth charges. Working in secrecy, they calculated the precise thermal and pressure combinations needed to trigger the steel flaw, determining that success required weapons that could create temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Celsius while simultaneously generating pressure waves of specific frequency and duration. The technical challenges were immense because existing explosive compounds couldn't produce the controlled thermal effects necessary to exploit the German steel weakness. Whitfield proposed using thermite-based charges combined with shaped explosive warheads, creating weapons that were part incendiary device and part precision munition. But developing functional prototypes would require manufacturing capabilities and test facilities that neither of them could access through official channels. Mitchell realized that he would need allies within the Navy's Experimental Weapons Division, but approaching them would mean revealing his unauthorized research and risking court-martial proceedings. The stakes continued to escalate as U-boat attacks claimed more Allied lives each day, with intelligence reports suggesting that Germany was preparing to deploy even larger submarine types equipped with advanced weapon systems. Time was running out, and Mitchell understood that conventional bureaucratic processes would take too long to save the thousands of sailors who would die while committees debated his proposals. The moment of ultimate defiance came on May 15, 1943, when Captain Thornbury ordered Mitchell to cease all metallurgical research and report for reassignment to conventional torpedo analysis. Standing in his superior's office, surrounded by maps showing the devastating extent of U-boat successes, Mitchell made a choice that would define his legacy and potentially alter the course of naval warfare. Instead of accepting the reassignment, he requested permission to present his findings directly to Admiral Sir Percy Noble, commander of Western Approaches Command and the man responsible for Allied anti-submarine strategy. Thornbury's response was immediate and furious, because no lieutenant commander had the authority to demand audiences with flag officers, particularly based on unauthorized research that violated direct orders. But Mitchell pressed forward, explaining that he had discovered a fundamental vulnerability in German submarine construction that could revolutionize anti-submarine warfare if properly exploited. He presented his steel analysis data, thermal stress test results, and preliminary weapons concepts, arguing that the Navy was fighting U-boats with outdated tactics based on incomplete understanding of enemy capabilities. Thornbury listened with growing anger, recognizing that Mitchell had not only disobeyed orders, but had compromised operational security by sharing classified materials with civilian researchers. The captain's final words were delivered with icy precision. Mitchell had 24 hours to submit a full report on his unauthorized activities and prepare for disciplinary proceedings that would likely end his naval career. But as Mitchell left that meeting, carrying folders full of data that could save thousands of lives, he realized that personal consequences had become irrelevant compared to the magnitude of his discovery. That evening, he composed a comprehensive report detailing his research findings and weapons proposals, but instead of submitting it through normal channels to Captain Thornbury, he sent copies directly to Admiral Noble's staff, the First Sea Lord's office, and the Ministry of Defense's Experimental Weapons Committee. It was an act of military insubordination that could result in court-martial, imprisonment, or discharge in disgrace. But Mitchell understood that some discoveries were too important for proper procedure and that the mathematics of war sometimes demanded sacrifices that went beyond personal consequences. As he sealed the envelopes containing his unauthorized research, he whispered a prayer for the thousands of Allied sailors whose lives might depend on whether his defiance would be seen as heroism or treason. The immediate aftermath of Mitchell's rebellion created chaos throughout the Royal Navy's command structure, as multiple departments tried to understand how a lieutenant commander had conducted unauthorized weapons research while sharing classified information with civilian contractors. Captain Thornbury recommended immediate court-martial proceedings, arguing that Mitchell had violated fundamental principles of military discipline and operational security. But Admiral Noble's staff recognized the potential significance of the steel analysis data, particularly given the desperate state of Allied shipping losses in the Atlantic. Dr. Whitfield's preliminary explosive formulations showed promise for creating the thermal effects necessary to exploit German submarine vulnerabilities. But practical weapons development would require resources and expertise far beyond Mitchell's improvised laboratory. Within 72 hours of receiving Mitchell's report, the Admiralty established a classified research program designated Operation Anvil, tasked with developing new anti-submarine weapons based on metallurgical analysis of German hull steel. Mitchell found himself transferred from disciplinary proceedings to technical leadership of the Navy's most secret weapons project, reporting directly to a committee that included representatives from the Ministry of Defense, the Royal Navy's experimental establishment, and Britain's top metallurgical experts. The irony was profound because his act of disobedience had transformed him from a potential court-martial case into one of the war's most important weapons developers. Working with expanded resources and official authorization, Mitchell's team began developing prototype thermal depth charges that could exploit the German steel flaw through precisely controlled explosions. The technical challenges proved even greater than anticipated, requiring new explosive compounds that could generate specific temperature and pressure profiles while remaining stable enough for deployment aboard Royal Navy vessels. Initial tests conducted at the Navy's experimental range in Scotland showed mixed results, with some prototypes successfully creating hull failures in captured German submarine sections, while others failed to produce the necessary thermal effects. But by August 1943, Mitchell's team had developed functional weapons that could reliably trigger catastrophic failures in German submarine steel under combat conditions. The new depth charges, designated Type X thermal munitions, weighed slightly less than conventional weapons, but could cause hull breaches that were impossible to repair, even if submarines survived the initial explosion. Production began immediately at Royal Ordnance factories across Britain, with the first operational weapons reaching Atlantic convoy escorts in September 1943. The tactical impact of Mitchell's discovery became apparent almost immediately, as Royal Navy destroyers began achieving unprecedented success rates against German U-boats. HMS Walker, commanded by Captain Frederick Walker, became the first vessel to deploy the new thermal depth charges in combat on October 7, 1943, during an engagement with U-boat 421 in the North Atlantic. The German submarine had been tracking convoy HX-259 when Walker's sonar operators detected its presence approximately 3,000 yards from the merchant vessels. Using conventional tactics, Walker's crew began a standard depth charge attack, but included two of Mitchell's experimental thermal munitions in their pattern. The results exceeded all expectations because while the conventional explosives caused minor damage to U-boat 421's exterior plating, the thermal weapons created catastrophic hull failure that sent the submarine to the bottom in less than 4 minutes. German survivors rescued from life rafts reported that their vessel's hull had simply come apart in ways they had never witnessed, describing metal failures that seemed impossible given the submarine's robust construction. Word of the successful engagement spread quickly through the anti-submarine warfare community, with destroyer commanders requesting immediate access to the new weapons. By November 1943, thermal depth charges were standard equipment aboard all Royal Navy escort vessels, and U-boat losses began climbing dramatically, while their effectiveness against Allied convoys diminished proportionally. German submarine commanders found themselves facing weapons that could destroy their vessels through hull failures rather than external damage, creating psychological pressure that affected operational decision-making throughout Dönitz's fleet. Intelligence intercepts revealed growing concern within German Naval Command about mysterious weapon failures that seemed to target specific vulnerabilities in submarine construction, but they lacked the metallurgical analysis capabilities to understand the true nature of Mitchell's discovery. The strategic impact became clear by January 1944, when German U-boat production could no longer replace operational losses, forcing Dönitz to withdraw many of his most experienced crews from Atlantic operations. What had begun as one man's unauthorized research had evolved into a weapon system that fundamentally altered the balance of naval warfare, proving that sometimes disobedience was the highest form of military service. The broader implications of Mitchell's discovery extended far beyond immediate tactical success, influencing metallurgical practices and weapons development throughout the remainder of World War II and into the post-war era. By spring 1944, American and Canadian naval forces had adopted thermal depth charge technology, with production facilities established in the United States to supply Pacific theater operations against Japanese submarines. Allied metallurgical analysis of captured enemy vessels expanded to include systematic evaluation of steel composition and stress characteristics, leading to improved materials science throughout the military-industrial complex. Mitchell himself received promotion to commander and appointment as Director of Naval Materials Analysis, overseeing research programs that applied similar principles to enemy aircraft, tanks, and surface vessels. His unauthorized collaboration with Dr. Whitfield evolved into a formal partnership that produced several groundbreaking advances in explosive chemistry and materials engineering. The German response came too late to affect the war's outcome, with emergency modifications to U-boat steel composition implemented only in the final months of 1944, when submarine operations had already been severely curtailed by Allied success. Post-war analysis revealed that Mitchell's discovery had accelerated the defeat of German submarine operations by approximately 18 months, saving an estimated 200,000 Allied lives and preserving millions of tons of critical supplies that might otherwise have been lost to U-boat attacks. Letters from surviving convoy sailors and merchant mariners praised the mysterious new weapons that had turned the tide beneath the waves, though few understood that their survival depended on one man's willingness to defy military authority in pursuit of scientific truth. Mitchell's methods became standard procedure for evaluating enemy equipment, with unauthorized research explicitly authorized under special circumstances where potential breakthroughs could significantly impact military operations. His story was classified for national security reasons until 1967, when declassified documents revealed how metallurgical analysis had contributed to Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. Dr. Whitfield went on to become one of Britain's leading explosives experts, developing new industrial and military applications based on the thermal shock principles first applied to anti-submarine warfare. The Royal Navy established the Mitchell Prize for Innovative Materials Research, recognizing scientific achievements that challenge conventional thinking about military technology. But perhaps the most significant legacy was philosophical, proving that rigid adherence to military hierarchy could sometimes prevent the very innovations necessary for victory in modern warfare. Mitchell returned to civilian life in 1946, accepting a position with British Steel where he spent the next 30 years developing new alloys for commercial and military applications. He married Dr. Margaret Whitfield in 1947, and their partnership continued to produce innovations in materials science that influenced everything from aircraft construction to bridge engineering. They raised 3 children in a modest home in Sheffield, returning Mitchell to the steel-making community where his father had taught him to listen to metal's secrets. Despite his wartime achievements, Mitchell rarely discussed his role in developing thermal depth charges, preferring to focus on peaceful applications of metallurgical knowledge. He published numerous technical papers on stress analysis and metal fatigue, becoming recognized as one of Britain's leading authorities on materials engineering without ever mentioning his contributions to anti-submarine warfare. Letters from former Royal Navy officers continued to arrive throughout his civilian career, expressing gratitude for weapons that had saved their ships and crews during the darkest days of the Atlantic battle. Many writers described specific engagements where thermal depth charges had successfully destroyed German submarines that had seemed invulnerable to conventional weapons, not realizing they were addressing the man responsible for their survival. Mitchell's children learned of his wartime accomplishments only after reading declassified documents as adults, discovering that their modest father had helped change the course of naval history through scientific innovation and military disobedience. His father Thomas lived to see his son's achievements recognized, spending his final years proudly telling fellow steelworkers that his boy had used Sheffield metallurgy to defeat German submarines. When Mitchell retired in 1976, he established a scholarship fund for working-class students pursuing metallurgical engineering, ensuring that others from similar backgrounds could access the education that had transformed his life. He died peacefully in 1991, surrounded by family members who understood that his greatest achievement had been transforming scientific curiosity into military innovation when conventional thinking proved inadequate to meet unprecedented challenges. His funeral was attended by former Royal Navy officers, metallurgical colleagues, and representatives from defense establishments across Europe and North America, all paying tribute to the man who had proven that sometimes breaking the rules was the only way to save lives and preserve freedom. The story of James Mitchell represents a profound lesson about the relationship between institutional authority and individual innovation in times of crisis. His discovery that German U-boat steel contained fatal flaws emerged not from official research programs, but from unauthorized investigation that violated direct military orders. The thermal depth charges that transformed Allied anti-submarine warfare existed only because one man chose scientific truth over bureaucratic compliance, risking his career to pursue research that his superiors had explicitly forbidden. This act of defiance ultimately saved hundreds of thousands of lives and helped secure Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic, demonstrating that rigid adherence to military hierarchy can sometimes prevent the very breakthroughs necessary for success in modern warfare. Mitchell's story challenges conventional thinking about military discipline and innovation, suggesting that the most important discoveries often come from individuals willing to question established procedures and pursue unconventional approaches to seemingly impossible problems. His metallurgical analysis revealed that victory in technological warfare requires not just superior weapons but deeper understanding of enemy capabilities and vulnerabilities that may not be apparent through traditional intelligence methods. The thermal shock weapons that emerged from his research proved that effective military innovation must combine scientific curiosity with practical engineering, transforming theoretical knowledge into battlefield capabilities that can decisively alter strategic outcomes. Perhaps most significantly, Mitchell's legacy demonstrates that true military leadership sometimes requires the courage to disobey orders when circumstances demand actions that transcend normal procedures and hierarchical constraints. His willingness to risk court-martial rather than abandon potentially life-saving research established principles that continue to influence military research and development policies throughout the modern defense establishment. The question remains relevant today as military organizations balance the need for discipline and coordination against the requirement for innovation and adaptability in rapidly changing technological environments. Would you have broken the order to pursue unauthorized research that could save thousands of lives? Or would you have obeyed military authority even when scientific evidence suggested alternative approaches? Comment below and share this story, so others remember that sometimes the greatest military service requires the courage to challenge the very institutions we serve. When doing so, can preserve the lives and freedoms that make our service meaningful.